Welcome to this Newswise Live Expert Spotlight panel. We've got several different experts who can talk about various aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic, including Dr. Christian Walzer, who's the Executive Director of Health Programs for the Wildlife Conservation Society. We also have Matthew Kavanagh from Georgetown University. He's Assistant Professor of Global Health and the Director of the Global Health Policy and Politics Initiative. We also have Anat Admati, Stanford University Graduate School of Business. She's Professor of Finance and Economics. And we also have Stephanie Preston from the University of Michigan. She's a Professor of Psychology. Each of these experts are going to answer some questions that we have prepared. We welcome the media to please chat your questions to us. I see one already in the queue. I'm going to figure out who's the best person to answer that question, Jesse. And we also want to invite that the experts can respond to each other. So experts, if you have something that you'd like to add to anything that your peer is saying, just raise your hand and I will go ahead and call on you when they're finished with their response. So I'd like to start with Dr. Walzer. Dr. Walzer has a specialty in the conservation of rare and endangered species, in particular in parts of Asia. So Dr. Walzer can tell us a lot about what we need to know about the wildlife and the origins of this disease. Dr. Walzer, can you explain to us some real basics about coronaviruses and the kinds of wildlife that they appear in, and what we know about them making the jump to humans?
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks for this invitation. Now, the coronaviruses are a really large group of viruses. They're so-called RNA viruses. They're very, very prevalent in domestic livestock. You'll find them in cattle and pigs. In our pets, they're quite common in cats and dogs. They don't, and obviously also in humans. But what we're particularly interested in here in this context is the large number of coronaviruses that circulate in wildlife species. So we will see those a lot in bats, of course. There's got a lot of press, obviously, recently. Some of the studies have shown up to 500 different coronaviruses in some species of bats. What's really important to understand is that these coronaviruses are not pathogens in that sense. They're just carried by the animal. They occur there naturally. They do not cause disease. It is only when they evolve and spill over into other species that they do cause and sometimes cause disease.
So what do we know about the ones that have made the jump to humans, like this current issue? There's been others in the past, right?
Right. There have been two important other ones. That's been the original SARS outbreak back in 2002, 2003, where the origin was also sourced in the bat species. And then there was an intermediate host, which was the civets, which then transferred to humans. And then the other one, more recent, 2012, is the MERS outbreak, where also the ancestral host is assumed to be a bat, and the intermediate host is a dromedary camel, which can transmit the virus. So these are pretty rare events, but as you know, when they do occur, they have massive implications.
You mentioned intermediate hosts. A civet, is that a wild cat?
Yeah, it's not a cat, but it's sort of between a cat and a raccoon sort of thing.
Okay. And a camel being the other. Those are pretty different kinds of species. What do we know about what are the risks for the viruses mutating, passing from one species to another as a bridge to humans? How does that happen, and how can we defend against it?
So these viruses have a natural mutation rate. This one is at about one point mutation every 2 weeks. So this is a completely natural process. And what we're talking about is a numbers game, basically. The viruses have to adapt so they can enter human cells. First, they have to jump a species, either directly into a human or into an intermediate host. So they need to adapt. Mostly their receptors have to change so they can enter the cell. And then on very rare occasions, will this virus that has entered a human cell actually be able to transmit to another human? That really happens very rarely. We have a lot more spillover events going on, which we just never know about because they either cause no disease or certainly don't transmit from human to humans. And you could see that if you look at the blood of people in rural areas and look at what's called seroconversion to antibodies, that they actually have contact with a lot more coronaviruses.
I have a few more questions for Dr. Walzer, and we'll come back to him. I want to ask one more, but I would just want to remind the media to please chat any questions that you have about this topic for him or for any of the other experts, of course. Dr. Walzer, before we go on to one of the other experts, I want to ask you real quick about what do we know about the COVID-19 virus? Was there an intermediary species involved in that infection? I know there have been a lot of questions about pangolins being part of it. That's maybe not known. What can you tell us about that? And also importantly, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about the trade in these kinds of exotic wildlife around the world. And we have some more questions for you about that.
Yeah, so what we know is that, or assume at least, and all evidence points to it, the ancestral host of this COVID-19 virus, this SARS coronavirus 2, is a horseshoe bat somewhere in Southeast Asia, China. That's the ancestral host, but it could not jump directly into humans. It has different receptor properties. So there is most likely an intermediary host. We do not know which species is this intermediary host or if it actually had one. That is unknown at the moment. It's really important to point that out. There's a lot of publications out there that are touting incredible titles, that the pangolin or whatnot. We really just don't know at the moment. And the problem is that the samples from the epicenter of the outbreak are not there. We just don't have the data. And as I said, the most important thing is that these markets in Southeast Asia and in China are very, very special because they have animals are alive. So they get to the market, they're alive, and they're shedding viruses, and that provides a lot of opportunities for spillover. And the multitude of species that you have there really enhance this numbers game, as I say, and make it easier for viruses to spill over.
Thank you, Dr. Walzer. I want to continue the discussion going into some of the global health policy and the politics and the ramifications under those topics with Matthew Kavanagh from Georgetown University. We'll come back to Dr. Walzer with some further questions. And again, media attending, please feel free to chat any questions for any of the experts and we'll get to those. Professor Kavanagh, can you tell us, as a basis for this discussion, the intertwining of international politics and global health policy? How are those two subjects linked, and maybe ways that they're not as linked as they should be in our discourse as a public?
Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for joining. So when we think about kind of international politics and we think about public health, we often think about them in different realms. So we have conversations about, in the United States here, whether we should have Medicare for all or whether we should have Obamacare. We have conversations around where should wars happen, et cetera. But what we are increasingly seeing is that global public health is in fact a massive foreign policy issue. And numerous folks have said for many years that a pandemic like this was likely. So the US National Academies of Medicine, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, Bill Gates, everybody has been predicting for many years that there would be a global pandemic very similar to what we're talking about right now. And the core question at hand is, will the world be able to cooperate, or will the world descend into isolationism and fail to cooperate? And what we're seeing right now is the descent into isolationism and a failure of cooperation. And so we have right now a political pandemic that's actually sweeping the world.
Very interesting. So you'd characterize this as both a health pandemic and a political one because of the response in public policy.
Absolutely. So what we're seeing around the world is that kind of the responses could be to sit together, use the international institutions that exist, like the United Nations, centered on the World Health Organization, and a variety of other international fora that exist and were built to respond to global crises. But instead, what we're seeing is a lot of energy put into travel bans, put into isolationist policies, and put into singular attention to what happens inside borders rather than an international solution. Particularly dangerous is the lack of engagement by the United States. So we've seen in past past crises like this, Ebola being a really good example, the critical role that the United States has played in both coordination and in aid, and actually bringing the world together to focus political energy and financial resources on responding. In this epidemic, and this what's now become a pandemic, we're seeing the US actually really cede that leadership, and it's leaving a major gap in the global political sphere about how do we actually respond together in ways that, rather than being competitive, are actually cooperative.
If any media have questions for Professor Kavanagh or any of the other experts, please chat them. In comparing the current situation in the US to the early stages of the outbreak in China, have there been missteps that resemble early missteps in China here in the US? And how would you characterize those?
Absolutely. So we now have a deeply challenging environment in which we have a global pandemic in the context of a US election and in the context of an international trade war between the United States and China. And so what we see is early in China, when the virus first broke out, there were political incentives that really undercut the response. So information was concealed, not just from the international community, which has gotten a lot of attention, but also from Beijing, that there was a failure to move information from the front lines of what was happening in Wuhan up to the central government for their capacity to respond. There was every incentive to not tell the leader bad news and to not draw political attention to an international, or to an outbreak that then became international for political considerations. The exact same thing has happened, ironically, here in the United States, where every incentive has been to not draw attention of the leader, for the President Trump, who's in the midst of an electoral campaign, to play down the severity, to talk about how we will soon be done. And if you look at the early moments, what President Trump's response was based on, and what the entire federal government's main response was based on, was the idea of keeping a virus out. So it very much played into the kind of the political rhetoric that's been going on in the United States about foreign intervention and about keeping dangers out. And so the president focused and the federal government focused on a travel ban from China, as if we could keep the virus out. Well, what we know is that travel bans don't work. They haven't worked, and they're not working now. And yet, instead of paying close attention to the things that could work, like ramping up testing, including cooperating across the world to ramp up testing, instead there was a real opportunity cost to instead focusing on clamping down borders and trying to stop this through restrictions on travel that frankly just didn't work.
You brought up testing, and we have a question related to that from Jessie Hicks at Vice. She's asking, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if Jessie is a man or woman, but Jessie's asking about at-home testing and what are the challenges and the realities involved in that. And I know you may not be in on the science necessarily, but as a health policy expert, what would you say about that, Dr. Kavanagh?
So there's a wide variety, and I'm not a doctor, so I won't speak from that perspective. But from a policy perspective, there's a number of regulatory hurdles that an at-home test would usually go through that would usually take quite some time. Now, what we know is that the FDA has a number of different channels through which it can move much faster in a crisis, and in which it's doing so. And so there's the kind of all chances that we will see an at-home test coming soon. It's not that there are no technologies out there. It's actually a question of overcoming a number of the regulatory barriers, and of course testing to make sure that the test itself is effective. That is one path to kind of moving things quickly. And had we taken the time, this is the kind of core message that I have, is had we taken the time that was achieved by China's response overall, we actually had months to prepare for the pandemic when it was coming. And so things like ramping up testing, figuring out how to get an at-home test, figuring out how to saturate the communities that are affected with testing, that could have put us on a very different trajectory that looks much more like what happened in South Korea. Where they were able to engage. They didn't have to lock down entire cities. Instead, they used rational social distancing policies along with blanket testing. And what they were able to achieve has been a flattening off of new infections that looks nowhere near what Italy is seeing, or what now the United States is seeing. But unfortunately, the political choice was not to focus on, for example, making an at-home test available sooner.
A question from Susan Berger for the Washington Post. While we do not seem to engage globally, can you address the U.S. response, specifically the White House, who is not even on the same page as the scientists? From Susan Berger.
You know, I mean, it's a huge challenge. So I think there are deep challenges with trying to respond to a pandemic in the middle of an election. And that is what we're seeing playing out. Unfortunately, the mixing in of messages on the stage, whether it's the White House briefings or on other stages, of the political messaging and the public health messaging is actually hugely problematic and worrisome, because one of the things that we know is critical in an open society, in a democracy, is clear communication about what the risks are, what's happening, and clear public health messaging. What we're looking for right now is the cooperation of the public and the cooperation of wide swaths of the population to do really hard things, to shut down economic activity, to stay home, to isolate. We're counting on people who have any symptoms to isolate themselves. We're counting on a massive amount of public cooperation with public health interventions. That only works if there's clear trust and if there's clear messaging that's coming out. I was deeply worried to see one of the kind of reports that came out recently that shows that only 37% of Americans say they trust what the president is saying. And that, I think, means that we actually have a real problem, because the person who needs to be giving clear public health messages needs to be trusted by a heck of a lot more than 37% of Americans.
Thank you. We're going to ask some more questions about the degradation of that trust because of these commingling of the science and the politics when we come back to Dr. Kavanagh. But I want to go next to Dr. Admati about the major relief bill package that's passing through Congress as we speak, voted on very late last night by the Senate. Professor Admati, can you start us off by just giving us a summary of the key points of this bill, in your opinion?
So in a bill like this, and remember, it is close to 900 pages of text. There are a lot of details. So there are the headline numbers, and people talk about that. In other words, in the political way in which this plays out, there is sort of the spin on it and the narrative on it, and there's the facts of it. And so here, again, the headline numbers are that people will get a one-time check. It's a small check, relatively, certainly in the Bay Area where I come from, $1,200 one time. In other countries, they have given it on a regular basis until while relevant. So that's one immediate thing on that individual level, that supposedly there's a check in the mail. That's one. Then the big items involve enormous amounts of money. And, you know, just to kind of give people an idea of these headline numbers, $2 trillion package, that's the largest ever. But just $1 trillion, just so you understand how, that's 12 zeros come after the one. And if you stack up $1,000 bills, which we don't even have, 1 trillion is 68 miles high, okay? And so 2 trillions is like 136 miles high of $1,000 bills. That is a lot of money. So what happens within that bill, there are thousands of pieces to it. And so there is the big numbers, sort of with the headline, 500 billion, so that's a quarter of it, goes to the control of Mnuchin, basically Treasury Secretary, to do all kinds of things with, some of which he tells it to do, specifically like, you know, $50 billion to airlines and another 8 for cargo airlines, as passenger airlines. And then there's some small business part. And so we can go a long time through that. I would characterize it as having occasionally a few, you know, useful things, but overall as being incredibly evident of the misguided financialization of the whole entire enterprise. We're here because we have a public health crisis. Our president in particular and others are extremely focused on, call it the stock market. I mean, you know, metrics of this sort, as if they measure what we need, even as an economy, not just as a society, in terms of what we value. Now we're starting to talk about people, prioritizing, the stock market over people's lives. Let 500,000 people die, they say. Now I go back to, and I'm glad it came up because that was going to be my point as well. And I just want to reinforce, testing is critical. And again, we are victims right now and ongoing to the broken politics of this country and of the world right now, exactly echoing what the political scientist said as somebody who's interested in political economy. I can speak to the financial implications and to all the different pieces of this, but I'm going to stop right here to say this favors corporations over individuals. And in that sense, it's very misguided policy. There would have been better ways to spend a lot of money to solve the underlying problem.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Walzer has something he'd like to add to that, and we'll come back to Dr. Ahmadi. Let me just get your sound on there. There you go, Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce the point both Matthew and Arti just said. The testing is clear. I'm a wildlife veterinarian. If I worked the way this is going at the moment without testing and tried to come up with policies and ideas, this is absolutely mayhem. There's no way you could work like that. And so when we state things like there are a lot of coronaviruses out in bats, that's because there's been a lot of testing ongoing in the last 10 years. And so I just really want to reinforce that doesn't sort of disappear. We need to test more on all levels.
Thank you, and well said. Back to Professor Ahmadi for some more analysis of the economics of this. We see unemployment numbers spiking in a report today, over 3.2 million new jobless claims. We'll see the full month's report, I guess, next Friday. With the relief package working through Congress and this news coming out today, how does that support some of the things that you would suggest this package do differently? And what else do you predict these jobless claims mean for the economy in the short term?
We have an economy that's become more of a gig economy, more of a contract labor economy. There's much less safety net than some of the safety nets have been created after the Great Depression and have eroded in recent years. And so we're seeing the fragility of the economy, the fragility of people who can't handle a small shock that has been discussed for the last few years, how fragile Americans are. And that's what we see is a hit people cannot take. Then, of course, we have great inequality, which means that some people can take huge hits. Are they taking these hits? I don't know if they're disproportionately, suffering as much as they can suffer without even blinking versus the people down who are really not in a position to absorb any shock. And so what we're seeing is the fraying of that economy built so much on temporary work, on hourly wages, on not even being employees like gig workers. And so unemployment claims will, are not even, sometimes people are not eligible for them because they're not employed. So they expanded it a little bit, and they need to do a lot more on unemployment. A lot of it is furloughing people, meaning they won't work, but they'll still be paid. They'll still be attached to their employer because businesses are forced to close for all these stay in place, shelter in place orders that we're under, that we should be under right at the moment, given that we don't know who's sick or not, and all of that. So yes, unemployment is spiking and will potentially go to 30%. We just, as a society, need to take care of people so that we don't increase the inequality in this country.
One more question for Dr. Ahmadi on the big picture economics aspect of this, and then I'm going to go to Dr. Preston for some of the psychology of the phenomenon that we're witnessing. Dr. Ahmadi, this relief package is clearly going to be adding to our current budget deficit and the national debt, and also we're presented with the likelihood of recession and a decline in GDP for the year. So in light of that, will the U.S. appear more attractive or less attractive when we get through this crisis for investors?
I don't know when you mean more or less, you mean relative to the past, relative to other countries? I mean, we're not.
Any context that you'd put that in is fine by me.
I mean, following up on the point about the U.S., ceding leadership and the world becoming more competitive. I mean, I think we're showing the just the terrible things that have happened to our politics and our economics in terms of, again, collaboration and versus competition and all of the trade wars and everything else. So I think the broken politics is harming also the economy, and I think that yes, that we can invest wisely to deal with this kind of shock that is putting people, freezing the economy basically. And if we had the right priorities, we could do better than by not having the right priorities. Back to how, you know, we will suffer longer because we're not investing in the right things, and because we're going to have a crumbling healthcare system if we don't have masks and personnel and all of that. And that's where the key approaches must focus, and they're not.
Professor Kavanagh, you had something to add to that.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, I think today the G20 leaders are meeting, and I think it's a real sign of a very worrying set of trends, right? So I think both China and the United States believe that the coronavirus may well shift the global order, right? And so what you see is the America First policy not working out quite as well as planned, but instead of collaborating and cooperating with the world's leading producer of medical supplies, and I want to just emphasize that, right? There is almost no way out of the crisis of personal protective equipment and of medical supplies without production from China for the world. But rather than collaborating and coordinating and figuring out how we scale those pieces up, what we've seen is aggressive moves and statements by this administration about using this crisis to gain economic and strategic advantage against China. Secretary Pompeo today was out talking about the kind of rumors and various things and getting caught in the Chinese PR conversation and picking a fight against China rather than actually thinking about how do you strengthen the global economy. There's no economic recovery in 2020 for the United States that's not linked to an economic recovery for China. And so the idea that somehow we can divorce these two things and we can go back to a hyper-competitive environment coming out of a global crisis like a pandemic is a folly. And so instead of that, I'm deeply worried that what we will see is continued competitive nature and continued harming of the economic positionality rather than the kind of trust building exercises that could put us on the footing to actually have global growth out of this. The U.S. economy is far too linked, and Dr. Admati can speak to it more than I can, but is far too linked to the economies of China and the rest of the world to somehow gain competitive advantage out of this. Our very best case scenario is to stop the brinkmanship back and forth and instead focus on how collaboration can be rebuilt.
Thank you. I want to go now to Stephanie Preston to talk about some of the psychology and the behavioral science with relation to all of these things. Professor Kavanagh talked about masks. We've seen those out in public and on news footage, B-roll of average citizens walking around with those masks. I think that's emblematic of some of the behaviors that we're seeing, which is maybe dubious about whether or not it's actually beneficial. But Stephanie, you have a lot, I think, to say about some of the what's wrong with people commentary that's going on both in the news and on social media with things like going out in public when there's supposed to be a shelter-in-place order, or behavior at grocery stores with panic buying and stockpiling. Can you put that into context for us and tell us some general thoughts about that?
Yeah, first I wanted to comment related to that on the conversation about shutting down borders instead of being more collaborative that Dr. Kavanagh talked about. It reflects like a deeply psychological phenomenon where when people are primed to think of disease or contamination or germs, it incites this kind of psychology of avoiding otherness. Any kind of otherness, like out-group members, people who aren't from your culture, even strange foods, ethnic foods you haven't had before, people start avoiding anything that's not familiar, highly familiar, when you prime them to think of the threat of disease. And so it's possible that that's even working its way into, you know, the national political realm. You know, probably they do have some strategic goals, but also people have this knee-jerk reaction to think of eliminating the other as a good strategy, as a heuristic. And it also relates to these masks, right? Like your mask, you think like contamination means something from the outside goes to the inside, right? People have this very simple heuristic for how this works. The contamination means something out there came in here that wasn't supposed to, right? So a mask is what they think going to protect them, and they the stockpiling is really like a rational response to what they perceive as the threat to themselves, right? Like you can't see how many masks there are in the world. That's not something you can conceptualize in your mind and at one time, at one place. We're not really given any information about that. And so you can't see the healthcare worker that needs the mask. So when you take a couple boxes for yourself, you're thinking, this is going to protect something from out here coming in here, as will, for example, crossing the street when I see somebody from East Asia, even if, you know, they were born in Toledo, they didn't come here, they didn't come from China, but like people have these like biases against other, which cause them to take these behaviors. And the hoarding of these goods is really a rational strategy that's evolved in your brain for hundreds of millions of years. So birds and rodents, multiple kinds of mammals hoard food, especially during a shortage. And these things are set off by stress and perceived uncertainty. So in the lab, I can cause an animal to start hoarding food by saying depriving it of food, or having a neighbor steal some of its food, or, you know, thinking you're not sure when the next meal is going to come. You can institute hoarding in species, including people. In the lab, we can give people a task where first they read a kind of distressing story with uncertainty about the health of their mother who's in the hospital. And then we offer them some products in a seemingly unrelated experiment. And people take more stuff when you make them feel uncertain or anxious, even if it's not related to the cause, right? So hoarding is adaptive and sensible when you actually have a shortage. But because it goes through anxiety, if you have anxiety about getting sick, about germs, about the economy, about job loss, about your bank account, that can also come out in this kind of stockpiling mentality. Like you might just feel like, I will feel more comfortable about this whole situation if I can go to the store and at least feel safe that I have a whole bunch of stuff that I need at my house, even if that anxiety wasn't actually caused by a perceived shortage. People have no clue if the grocery store is going to go away or run out or continue to be replenished, right? So there's a high level of uncertainty that no one is addressing. And what they're doing, most people, what they're doing is totally rational, but and evolved, and you know, your brain does this whether or not you're conscious of it, but you have to make sure it's like tied to the cause of the anxiety. But most people aren't, you know, they have the extreme examples of the brothers who had 17,700 bottles of sanitizer in a storage unit, and they're selling them for prices, you know, gouging prices on Amazon. And most people aren't doing that, right? So if you read the news, you don't want to go, oh, people, you know, people writ large are terrible, right? Like people in general are not terrible. They're just getting just enough, they think, for their family. But these cases make it into the news, obviously, because they're extreme. So you want to be careful not to think of those as like representative of what people are doing. And the public shaming worked, right? They got even death threats because of this hoarding of the hand sanitizer, and ended up donating it all to a church and the state government in order to distribute to people who needed it. So, you know, we have all these evolutionarily built-in mechanisms to ensure protection, to ensure we hoard when resources are available if we think they won't be. And we have this built-in mechanism to social shame people who we think are like deviating from the rational level of resource taking.
A couple of questions from the chat that I think it'd be great for you to address in that context. And first from Jesse Hicks from Vice. Do you believe it was a mistake early on, public officials telling people not to buy and use these masks because the average person wouldn't use them correctly? and now that they could be useful as the epidemic is increased, is that public trust kind of degraded because of the confusing message about that? So when it comes to the psychology understanding of that behavior, the message changing, has that made people susceptible to not trusting the advice?
I mean, I think these are such fluid situations. People have a very good capacity to shift their information processing and their decision making online dynamically. So new information or changing information, I don't think is that bad. What is bad for degrading trust is if the individual delivering the news has been shown to be obscuring information or to have a systematic bias, especially in these polarizing times. And with the early discussions about China maybe not releasing transparent information about the level of threat, I think individuals become tagged as untrustworthy, and then their messages are difficult to convey. That's definitely a problem. And people also, they are taking direct information from what they can see. So people have no clue. Like the man who hoarded the hand sanitizer, he was crying in a video saying, "I'm so sorry, I didn't know." You know, like my job as a person in, you know, the business world is to acquire goods I think that are coming hot and then sell them and then move on to the next hot thing, right? Like I'm just doing that all the time. And I bought hand sanitizer, but I didn't know it was going to become a threat of this magnitude, right? So as soon as he realized it was a threat of that magnitude, it fed into his response to give it all up. So people have to be provided with very salient, visual, concrete images of this shortage and the healthcare workers and the drastic measures they're needing to take. And because your brain can only respond and sympathize with and integrate information, it really directly encounters. Abstractions have very little impact on your behavior.
From Susan Berger with the Washington Post, isn't it also true that we feel more in control by hoarding since nothing else right now is in our control? What would you say to that?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, the uncertainty is unsettling, and then feeling like you have enough or even more than enough or a little more than enough maybe is making you feel secure. So security is like, I have the threat controlled. And one aspect of that we have to be careful of, though, is the grocery store is one of the only things still open, right? So people stay home, they get bored, they get anxious. Buying stuff makes them feel more secure. They want to make sure they are replenishing supplies. But like the degree of contamination is going to keep increasing in the United States, and the risk of going to the grocery store is going to keep increasing. So you have to be careful that you don't use the grocery store as a displacement behavior for all of your anxiety, because it's going to put you at an increasing risk as time goes on in the next couple of weeks. And you, just like I said with the visual threat, you can't see germs. You don't know where they are, right? And it doesn't even matter if you're 6 feet away from somebody. If 10 minutes ago, somebody walked through the air and coughed particles into the air, and then you walked through and sniffed it, right? They're saying you can get it from these droplets in the air that last for 3 hours. We can't see these things, right? So people are going to have to use a little bit of like top-down control over these impulses and be a little self-aware, so they don't put themselves at increasing risk.
Thank you. I want to turn again to Dr. Walzer. Please, in the chat media, please ask any questions that you have. Dr. Walzer, it's been brought up about some of this fear and anxiety, especially with otherness. And there's been a lot of issues and reports about discrimination and prejudice against Asians, other races that can be viewed as a threat in this situation. And I understand that, you know, policy about the wildlife trade, both legal and illegal, and whether or not China should crack down on that is a big issue for you and for your organization. How do you think we can balance advocacy for a safer, appropriate policy with respecting culture and traditions, and respecting the fact that some of these prejudices can come about during cases like this? What do you think about that?
So just to start off with, I just want to make it very clear that the government of China has decided at the highest echelon to ban wildlife trade in relation to consumption, and Vietnam has followed suit. So it's not only, you know, sometimes we're even behind what the respective governments have already decided. So that ban is in place. At the moment, there's actually a ban on all wildlife trade in China, and it's being rigorously enforced, as our teams in the country tell us. So, but China is now moving to permanently ban all consumption of wildlife, be it farmed or wild caught, legal and illegal, if it's sustainable. All these things really don't matter in the context of an infection. And Vietnam is following suit. So that's the first thing. The other thing I think we always overestimate is this whole cultural context. There is obviously a long tradition. I mean, as we have here in the United States or in Europe, where I come from, we eat wildlife, we hunt it, we eat it. But there's a big difference in trading. You can go out and hunt your deer here in New York, in the States, but you can't go and sell it to the restaurant or drop it off at a restaurant, or actually go catch it alive and bring it into the restaurant, which would be a much closer analogy of what's happening in China. Now, the other thing is a large part of this trade does not have thousands of years of culture. It is actually a reaction of some of the biggest hunger disasters which happened in the end of the 1970s in China, where the central government tried to get the rural population to breed wildlife to just meet their nutritional demands, so basically to get their protein. And then that was reinforced about 20 years ago when, to lift the rural population out of poverty, one of the strategies was, oh, well, we'll have them farming wildlife. And these are very few species. There's a lot of bamboo rats, porcupines, and civets, for example. So there is this cultural context. We have to be very careful, and especially we have to be cognizant of the fact that there are large populations, especially indigenous peoples and local communities, that are dependent on wildlife for protein intake. They don't have alternatives. But what we're talking about here is mostly urban populations which are consuming wildlife as a luxury item. So it's again this problem of inequality. We have people who have money, the rising middle class, that are buying pangolins illegally, consuming them. And so we really need to be careful. Yes, we need to be cognizant of the fact some populations do need this protein intake and there's no alternatives. But on the large scale, these are huge urban markets where a lot of criminal networks are making a lot of money trading animals on a global scale. Remember, these pangolins are not locally caught. They're coming from Africa, most of them now, because they've managed to get rid of most of the Asian ones. So this is a huge market with a lot of profit to be made.
Thank you for clarifying that for us, Dr. Walter. I want to go next to Dr. Admati, and I think this is a question I'd like all the experts to address from your own point of view, of course. But Dr. Admati, as an economist, how can we incentivize people having more faith in our institutions that really shine in moments like this with good experts and expertise and competence, and separating that from political messaging? How can we get people to differentiate between those things and believe in them?
I think this is a great question. My entry and my even being here came out of the financial crisis 2008. When I stepped in from my protected shell of being a theorist in finance, I was shocked to discover both the politics and eventually the psychology as well, which is why I'm so really grateful that you put together an interdisciplinary panel like that. Because, you know, Dr. Preston was talking about people needing to trust the person speaking, but we also have the phenomena of what's called willful blindness, or people, you know, and it was mentioned sort of what's real versus, you know, abstract, or what you can feel, like moral disengagement, how you can disengage, like the person who bought the sanitizer disengaged morally from what he was doing, like he wasn't thinking about it, he wasn't aware of it. Now, in the space, going back to your question about experts, again, and a few of us here who do know some pieces of this puzzle are saying, look at all this ignorance out there. And I am always shocked by just how people believe sort of what they want to believe. and where you can have the nonsense winning a policy debate. The first manifesto I wrote 10 years ago was called Fallacies, Irrelevant Facts, and Myths. And really, it was about things that were a little bit esoteric. And then I wrote a book to try to explain it to staffers, to journalists, you know, a little bit of my discipline in words. And really what you see is, you know, we already heard that people have been warning about pandemics. We heard in my area, people are warning about excessive debt and excessive fragility and crisis, and nobody wants to hear it while it's kind of an abstract threat. And that's why we find ourselves. So this short-sightedness and this refusal to listen to the people who really know and be thoughtful about policy is really part of why we sometimes suffer all these consequences of financial crisis, of pandemics like that, when there's bad policies and then bad politics around it. So I think that's where a lot of us come into sort of alternative facts and myths and all kinds of anti-vax and all kinds of other things that our social media sometimes makes worse.
Thank you. Professor Kavanagh, we talked a little bit before this about the degradation of trust in politics and democracy when we see contradictory messages out there and we see those things intermingled too much, misinformation along with good information. How do we convince the public to differentiate between those things and have confidence in competent experts?
I think one key is to understand that we simply cannot separate out public health messaging from political messaging. The two are deeply intertwined, and as has been talked about a few times, the messenger matters a lot, right? So I think there's a few things to keep in mind. One, we should be hearing a lot more from the public health experts who are allowed to speak on their own. We should be hearing from Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. We should be hearing from them about kind of public health messaging about what that looks like, with applause from behind from our political leaders, so that we have one voice that's speaking. We know over and over again that in a time of crisis, being able to separate that out and have people's ability to understand both messages, political and public health, and not intertwine them. But we also need to understand, kind of in the broader context, that the ways in which trust is going to be built is what they see political actors doing. And so we know, for example, that we are in the middle of an electoral, in the middle of an election cycle. And that means that everyone engaged in the political class is trying to win elections. Everyone knows that. That's not a big surprise. The core question is, can they see them coming together on issues that matter to the public? And can we get accurate information? And we've seen ways in which the worry about democracy is actually infusing everything else that's going on, right? So one of the things around the world is that we've actually seen a decrease in the democratic character of governance in countries across the board. So overall, the world has become less democratic. Overall, political scientists judge the United States to also be becoming less democratic. And that's very worrisome, right? Because we saw in China that what happens when the state shuts down open media and free expression, when they engage in a lot of propaganda activities, we've seen that when that goes unchecked, that undermines pandemic response. The same is true here in the United States. So when you see attacks again and again on media as ineffective and partisan, and the idea that there is no truth out there, that actually can really, it's a political message and it's an intentional political message, but it can undermine trust in democracy. And that's what we're seeing in the measures across when we do surveys, et cetera. And so that's deeply worrying.
Thank you. I want to go next to Professor Preston with the same question. How do we address and maybe inoculate people against the susceptibility to confusion and mistrust because of these issues with contradictory messaging out there from public officials, and getting them to trust in the experts who are competent?
Right. Well, I fully agree with what was just said, that we need to be able to hear it from the horse's mouth, as it were. So like, for some reason, our politicians are always the ones standing at the podium, and then like the doctor, the scientist is standing back here, and they don't ever get to say anything. And they're the one who actually knows, right? So people understand expertise and they would trust the words of these people, but we have to hear it from them. We have to be able to have a line of communication open with them. And so forums like this are important because the scientists need to learn how to figure out how to speak to people in a way that doesn't seem abstract or obtuse or, you know, too hard to understand. Because, you know, I think the trust in scientists themselves isn't as high as it used to be. People believe, you know, like in the 1950s, people thought scientists were awesome because they were getting us to the moon and, you know, curing diseases that were worldwide. And now they're just like, I don't know, there's these eggheads and I can't understand anything they're saying. And, you know, like, just tell me the bottom line. Like, am I supposed to go or am I supposed to stay, right? Like, we're always hedging to make it more accurate, and we're always throwing out hedge words. And we need to get better at communicating directly and clearly with people and having some bottom line as to what we think they should do. But I think one of the biggest problems is sort of referred to this intertwining with political bias. We're living in these bubbles, right? So if my social media is my bubble, then I have no clue what's happening in the other bubble, right? When the election of 2016 happened, I was like completely shocked because everyone I heard from was in my bubble and they were just saying what I thought, which was, you know, it's for sure going to go this way and then it goes another way. So like I am getting literally 1,000 posts in Facebook a day about flattening the curve, but I have no clue if they're getting these graphs in the other bubble. And are these graphs clearly conveying what people are supposed to do? Most of them don't have an x-axis, right? Like there's no numbers on it. So like, okay, we're gonna like flatten, and then like, when do we stop flattening? Like, when do we come back to life? None of them have information in them. So I think we have to get a little better at our communication skills and, you know, tailor them to how people are actually getting their information. People shouldn't be expected to be doing research projects at home. They have to like go to work. They have to take care of their kids. They're already like stressed beyond belief. You know, doing a research project about statistics is like literally the last thing on most people's minds.
Well said, Professor. I want to go to Dr. Walzer as well for this same question, and then I have another round of questions for each of the experts kind of more focused on your area. And of course, any of the media that have any questions, please do chat them. We'd be happy to get those in as well. We're getting close to an hour, but if we've got enough time to do that, we will. Dr. Walzer, what are your thoughts about that question? You mentioned, for example, the comparison between testing bats in the wild for instances of coronaviruses that might be a threat and how thorough that's been done in the past, and why can't we test people that might have been exposed to this coronavirus and the incongruity there. How in light of contradictions like that can we get people to start paying better attention to the experts who have competence in these areas?
Well, yeah, I mean, I really agree with what everyone said just before me now. It's interesting who's doing the speaking and who actually has the knowledge. There's a really, obviously a disjunct there, which is massive. The other one is, you know, it's come up several times, oh, we knew about this. And I just want to point out that already in 2018, the WHO had put the so-called disease X on their list, which is exactly what we have now. So it's not a surprise. And then, you know, there's been media reports that there was I think in the fall of 2019, there was an exercise, a scenario, just to see about responsiveness here in the United States. And I'm sure this happened somewhere else as well. It's not only about happening here, where this kind of pandemic was played out and everyone realized, well, this is not going to go well. We need to do something else. But the problem of translating, I think this come up as well today, translating science into policy, we've really failed there sometimes. And it just, the time is too long and it's too complicated. And then obviously we all suffer from this discounting the future. So future threats just don't harm us as much as, you know, what's going to happen tomorrow on our shares or whatever.
There was a question about the PPE, the personal protective equipment, and policy about that, and some healthcare workers having consequences when they complain publicly about it. Nurses and other healthcare workers facing consequences like losing their jobs when they complain publicly about the lack of personal protective equipment. Dr. Ahmadi, do you have anything you want to say about that?
I just want to say that whistleblowers often suffer, and I've encountered some in the context of all kinds of corporate wrongdoings and financial fraud and other things like that. And so now the people on the front line are these nurses and healthcare providers. And if they're put in a position where they have to risk their lives, they are also endangering others, and we really need them. If we have a breakdown of the sort of governance of our healthcare system in terms of the people in the front line and the people making decisions who are supposed to supply them with these masks and this equipment, it becomes an economic question. I mean, back to the competition, you know, our president and our federal government has allowed states to go competing for masks in the open market. And that is just unconscionable. We have to collaborate even within this country rather than start fighting out over these things that are so essential for people's lives. So once again, you see a cynical way of approaching it rather than the sort of sensible human societal way of approaching it. And so I would be worried about whistleblowers, and I would find channels for them to speak so that they're not suffering the consequences. It's hugely important.
Any other comments on that, Professor Preston?
I just want to say how hugely important it is to public health to allow these people to speak, because those are the times when people get a very salient, meaningful understanding of threat, right? You have to like see it from the front line to really internalize how big a problem it is. So it's like to the hospital's benefit for people to understand how grotesque things are at the hospital right now, because then they'll take more precautions and then you won't have so many people showing up at the hospital, right? So this morning there was a woman who said, oh, I don't care if I get fired from my job, you need to know what things are like. And she mentioned having a refrigerated truck to put bodies in. And it's almost like taboo to even say something like that, right? Like it's so terrible. But like, you need to know how terrible things are to titrate your risk. And people, if they don't know how terrible it is, they're not going to avoid risk.
We had people risking their lives to tell us a story from Wuhan too.
Right, right, absolutely. Very good examples all. I hope that answers your question, Lynn. Any questions for any of the experts? Media, please do chat those. Dr. Walzer, kind of more back to your area of focus. What would you recommend or steps that we should be looking at now to prevent the possibility of another coronavirus type mutation jumping from animals to humans? What policies need to be put into effect? What nations are areas that should be focusing on this kind of thing? Any thoughts about that? As you just mentioned, the inherent bias of discounting the future because it's unknown. We're going to listen to you, a competent expert, telling us what you might predict and what we should be looking ahead to.
So one thing we do know, we know that the wildlife is teeming with these viruses, and we know that the Southeast Asian context and China, the markets having a lot live animals brought to these markets, mixed together, admixing multiple species, slaughtering on site, all these things provide an absolute super interface for spillover events. Irrespective now of this, when we trace this one back to some intermediate host, closing these markets permanently for consumption, these live animal markets throughout Southeast Asia, and that's, you know, it's China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, in parts in Myanmar, northeastern India. That's the first thing we need to do. We need to stop these live animal markets that trade in wildlife. That's really the most important. We obviously need to work on the education and changing in behavior. We do want to work it on multiple pillars. We can't just say, okay, you can't eat this. It needs to be supported with a broad education campaign on the risks. And then, unfortunately, we also have to address it on a more global scale. There are several other hotspots around the world which we're not addressing at the moment because you know, we're focused so strongly on Southeast Asia at the moment. But there is obviously you know, in Latin America, there's a broad area where there's a lot of potential for spillover, and then of course the Central African forests similarly, where there's wildlife trade going on and movement of meat and products out of these areas with their respective viruses. So banning the wildlife trade for consumption is really key to reduce the risk. It's not going to eliminate it. They're also really important. Everyone has to understand there's always going to be risk, but we're just going to reduce the amplitude of that risk.
Thank you, Dr. Waltzer. For Dr. Admati, a question from the chat. Jesse Hicks at Vice asks, how can we best take advantage of this current crisis to potentially remake our economic system in a more just way? You've talked a lot about, very eloquently, I might add, about the fragility of the banking system and how that's a feature and not a bug. Is this an opportunity for transformation?
I hoped that about the last crisis, and I needed to really reflect on why that didn't really happen. Why they always would say, "Oh yeah, stuff happens," and then let's just go back and let's forget it and not learn the lessons. So will we learn the lessons about the policies that were just proposed? Did we learn the lessons from the kinds of proposals that very simple, straightforward proposals that I've made after the crisis, for which I had to conclude it takes a village to maintain a bad system, because there's so many enablers to the continued distortions and endangerment that goes on in the financial sector completely unnecessarily because of bad policy. So we have bad policies everywhere, and so the economic system and our entire democracy really need some work. Maybe this shakes people up. Maybe people understand more that we need unconflicted experts to be there and hold politicians to account. And the public then needs to hear from unconflicted experts to know how to do the politics then, and therefore how to do our government and governance, so we can have collectively the right actions being taken on our behalf. And that would be the fixing of the economic system as well as other systems that our society seems to have kind of let deteriorate.
Thank you, Dr. Admati. To Professor Kavanagh, about the current campaign season and the upcoming primaries, changes to schedules of certain things. If this pandemic draws out, it may impact conventions over the summer and get out the vote efforts in the fall. What are your thoughts about what factors we need to be aware of and looking at in terms of the political process and what that does to our democracy in light of this pandemic?
So this is a really hugely challenging thing to think about, how to maintain democratic openness in a moment of a global pandemic without a cure and without widespread testing. I mean, I think first of all, my hope is deeply that we are able to ramp up testing quickly, because that's basically the only way we are likely to be able to leave our houses and do the kinds of things that the administration is talking about wanting to do, but simply will not be possible without this level of testing. But on the elections, I think we need to be very careful. Iran held a set of elections on February 21st, and now 10% of MPs have contracted coronavirus. And so we need to recognize that the virus is real, that it poses some real challenges on democratic practice, but we can use the tools of technology that we have in communication to actually move ahead with things. One of the things we saw, and we've talked a bunch about trust, is that in the Democratic Republic of Congo, they delayed elections in one of the areas that was hardest hit by Ebola, and it deeply undermined trust in government in ways that have not been recoverable. And so I think really thinking about how do we move this forward. Even in 1918, under the massive flu that happened, the elections in the United States still went forward. In 1864, there were elections during the Civil War, and proposals to postpone them were not agreed to. So I think it's time to say, how do we have elections? How do we use mail-in elections? How do we use virtual campaigning? The mail-in elections piece would take changes, acts of Congress, and then probably throughout acts from each of the states to be able to allow that to happen. But it can, and it's important that we do keep the election on track and that we allow that democratic openness and just move to where it is. One side note is simply that the president does not have the power to change the date of the election or to change anything about the election. And so it's important for us to kind of all be very clear about that, because we can be sanguine about many things, but the idea of democracy being a rock that can't shift is something we should be very careful of, because we've seen over time that democracy is about practice, it's about what happens, and it's not just inherently there. So we should guard against any moves to undermine democracy and to delay elections.
Thank you, Professor. Last but not least, I want to give Professor Preston a chance to answer one more question, and we'll be pretty much out of time. Professor Preston, for people dealing with the anxiety and the fear of all this uncertainty, we've talked about some of the hoarding and stockpiling of resources, and there's obviously other manifestations that these kinds of things can take as a stressor to our daily lives. What signs and sort of self-assessment and self-care would you recommend that the average person consider for themselves to try to understand when their behavior crosses a line from things that are adaptive to things that are maybe disordered?
Right. It's sometimes hard to know, right? Especially like how much toilet paper is enough? I don't know. Right? Like, I don't know if I'm doing something excessive or normal. I don't know how much you have. I don't necessarily want to tell you how much I have, right? Like, there's this like lack of transparency and information flow that makes it difficult to know if what you're doing is normal or typical or okay, right? So I think one important thing that tells us is social norms are very important, right? So you might not want to go against delay discounting if there's something you really want, but you would if everyone around you would think that was bad, right? Like if everyone around you thinks it's cool to do X, then you'll think it's cool too, right? Like with the endangered species, if the rich people are still thinking it's really cool to have a party and serve this dish of a, you know, rare species, they're going to keep doing it regardless of what the law is. And people are going to keep going out and meeting with their friends if they think it won't be like socially judged, right? But in my little bubble, if I showed a picture on my social media of me at like a party, people would freak out and start yelling at me, right? So it's like a social norm, like a pressure being enforced on my behavior. But if you feel like you're getting stressed, you have to do the same things you would advise yourself to do in any other time, right? Like, so ways to avoid getting overwhelmed or to keep your focus or to not use all these displacement behaviors, you want to have a schedule. So you don't get just bored and eat all your food, or you don't get bored and go to the grocery store and infect yourself, right? Like you have a schedule of things you're going to do. Include exercise. Exercise increases your heart rate, stimulates your mind. It avoids this tendency to kind of like feel like a sloth and want to eat and get depressed, which can happen if you're just at home all the time and you're understimulated. You need to find people who you